Raymond Ellis, a disabled Navy veteran, faces humiliation when new manager Derek Morrison demands he vacate his table for normal customers at his usual Sunday lunch spot. As Raymond struggles to comply, his veteran ID falls, unnoticed by the indifferent crowd. But three Navy SEALs, Will Monroe, Marcus Chen, and James Rodriguez, witness the injustice. With quiet resolve they stand, confronting Derek with authority and honor. Their actions spark a turning point, hinting at a deeper reckoning. What happens next? Will Raymond's dignity prevail? And will Derek face the consequences of his prejudice? If Raymond's story of resilience and honor moved you, join our community. Subscribe to my channel for more stories that celebrate courage and respect. Your support helps us share tales of everyday heroes. Hit that subscribe button and be part of something meaningful. Honor lives here. Raymond Ellis, a 78-year-old man with a weathered face etched by time and trial, sat quietly at table 6 in the small diner near the gas station. His right leg, lost below the knee decades ago in the chaos of Vietnam, rested beside the crutch that had become his steadfast companion. Every Sunday, this modest restaurant had been his haven, a place where the world slowed down enough for him to breathe. Table 9 by the window was his usual spot, where sunlight spilled across his newspaper, warming his hands as he read. But today, table 9 was taken, and he'd settled for table 6, closer to the walkway but still within the familiar hum of the diner's routine. He ordered his usual cold-cut sandwich, no cheese, and black coffee, his voice soft but steady, carrying the weight of a life lived with purpose. For 3 years, this place had been more than a diner to Raymond. It was a sanctuary, a ritual that tethered him to the world beyond his quiet suburban home. After church, he'd drive his old Honda, its engine rattling but reliable, to this unassuming spot where the food was simple and the faces familiar. Mrs. Rodriguez, the server who knew his order by heart, always greeted him with a warm smile. She'd slip extra napkins onto his table without a word, aware that his trembling hands sometimes betrayed him. To her, Raymond wasn't just a customer. He was a man whose story she glimpsed in the careful way he moved, in the faded veteran ID card he wore around his neck. Not for pride, but as a quiet explanation for his slow steps and deliberate gestures. Today, though, the air felt different. A new manager, Derek Morrison, loomed over the diner like a storm cloud. Tall and stern-faced, he'd been brought in by the corporate chain that had recently bought the place, tasked with squeezing efficiency and profit from every square foot. To Derek, Raymond was a problem. An elderly man with a crutch, taking up valuable table space, ordering modest meals that didn't justify his presence in a prime spot. Derek didn't see the 23 years Raymond had served in the U.S. Navy, including 2 grueling tours in Vietnam, where shrapnel had torn through his leg and courage had held him upright. He didn't see the medals tucked away in a drawer at home, or the nightmares that still woke Raymond in the dead of night. All Derek saw was an obstacle to his vision of a streamlined, profitable operation. "Excuse me, sir," Derek's voice cut through the diner's murmur, sharp and loud enough to turn heads. "This table needs to be available for normal customers. Could you move to the back section?" Raymond blinked, confusion knitting his brow. The word normal landed like a slap, though he didn't flinch. "I've already ordered my food," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a quiet disbelief. He shifted in his seat, his hand instinctively reaching for his crutch, as if preparing to defend his place in the world he'd carved out here. Derek shrugged, his expression cold. "Policy from above. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air, heavy with dismissal. A few customers glanced up, their eyes flickering with unease, but no one spoke. No one moved. Mrs. Rodriguez, standing nearby, averted her gaze, her hands twisting a dish rag. The diner, once a cocoon of comfort, now felt like a stage where Raymond's dignity was being tested. Inside, Raymond's chest burned with a mix of humiliation and resolve. He'd faced worse. Jungles thick with danger. Nights when death seemed closer than life. But this moment stung in a way he hadn't expected. He was no stranger to sacrifice. His body bore its marks, and his soul carried its scars. Yet here, in a place he'd come for peace, he was being told he didn't belong. Slowly he reached for his hand, his movements deliberate, as if each one was a silent assertion of his worth. As he stood, his veteran ID card slipped loose, tumbling to the floor with a faint clatter. The faded plastic glinted under the diner's lights. Its words, "Disabled Veteran, U.S. Navy, 1971." A quiet declaration of his life, unnoticed by those who hadn't cared to look. To Raymond, that card was more than identification. It was a testament to the years he'd given, the pain he'd endured, the comrades he'd lost. It was a reminder that his slow gait and careful steps were not weaknesses, but the cost of service for a country he still loved, even when it seemed to forget him. As he stood, his back straight despite the weight of Derek's words, he felt the eyes of the diner on him. But he kept his own gaze forward, his heart steady, refusing to let shame take root. At table 7, just a few feet away, 3 men in Navy dress uniforms had been eating quietly, their presence unnoticed amid the confrontation. A lieutenant commander, his insignia gleaming, had set down his fork, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene unfold. Beside him, a petty officer first class and a petty officer second class had also paused, their forks hovering over half-eaten meals. Something in their bearing, the shoulders squared, the eyes sharp with recognition, marked them as men who understood service, who knew the weight of a veteran's card. They'd been silent until now, but the sight of Raymond's ID on the floor stirred something deep within them. The lieutenant commander's gaze lingered on Raymond, feeling a flicker of respect and anger crossing his face. He saw not an old man, but a brother in arms, a man whose sacrifices had paved the way for their own service. The petty officer first class clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists as he glanced at a Derek, whose ignorance felt like an insult to every uniform he'd ever worn. The younger petty officer, newer to the Navy, felt a surge of protectiveness for the man he'd never met but already understood. They exchanged a glance, a wordless agreement passing between them. As Raymond steadied himself, preparing to leave with the quiet dignity that had carried him through worse, the 3 men rose as one, their movements deliberate, their uniforms crisp, their silence louder than any words could have been. The diner seemed to hold its breath as they stepped forward, their eyes fixed on Raymond, not with pity, but with solidarity. The air in the restaurant seemed to thicken as the 3 men rose from their seats at table 7, their movements synchronized, deliberate, and heavy with unspoken resolve. There was no rush in their actions, no theatrical flourish, just the steady, purposeful grace of individuals who had seen enough of the world's injustices to know when to draw a line. Their Navy dress uniforms, crisp and immaculate, gleamed faintly under the soft glow of the diner's lights, a silent testament to their service. Each man carried the weight of his experiences, etched into the lines of his posture, the quiet intensity of his gaze. They had been eating their lunch in near silence, their conversation minimal, as if the gravity of their shared history made small talk unnecessary. But when the veteran's ID card hit the floor with a faint clatter, something shifted in the atmosphere, like a storm gathering force. Lieutenant Commander Will Monroe was the first to move, stepping forward with the calm authority of a man who had led others through chaos and come out the other side. His voice, steady and measured, cut through the hum of the restaurant. "Sir, please sit back down," he said to Raymond, his tone carrying a quiet power that didn't demand attention, but commanded it nonetheless. Will's eyes, sharp and assessing, flickered briefly to the man at the center of the scene, Raymond Ellis, a disabled veteran whose crutch rested against the table, whose hands trembled slightly as he reached for the ID card now lying on the floor. Will recognized the weight of that moment, the indignity of being dismissed in a place where you should feel safe, and it stirred something deep within him, a blend of duty, empathy, and unyielding resolve. At table 7, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen had been the one to set down his knife first, the faint clink of metal against the plate marking the moment he decided enough was enough. Marcus was a SEAL, his body honed by years of grueling training, his mind sharpened by missions that demanded precision under pressure. He stood, his movements fluid yet controlled, and his dark eyes locked onto the restaurant manager, Derek Morrison, with an intensity that could make even the boldest hesitate. Marcus had seen Raymond enter earlier, noticed the careful way he maneuvered with his crutch, the respectful nod he offered the server, Maria. There was a quiet dignity in Raymond's bearing, a strength that lingered despite the visible scars of his service. Marcus felt a pang of recognition, a silent kinship forged by shared sacrifice. He knew what it meant to carry the weight of war long after the battlefield was left behind, and the sight of Derek's dismissive attitude lit a fire in him that he struggled to keep contained. Petty Officer Second Class James Rodriguez, the youngest of the trio, followed suit, rising to his feet with a quiet intensity that belied his age. James was no less a SEAL, his presence commanding despite his softer features and boyish frame. His eyes, bright with a mix of conviction and restrained anger, darted between Raymond and Derek. James had grown up idolizing men like Raymond, veterans who had served decades before he was born, whose sacrifices had paved the way for his own path in the Navy. Watching Derek treat Raymond like an inconvenience, as if his service was a footnote to be swept aside, felt like a personal affront. James's hands clenched briefly at his sides, his heart pounding with the urge to speak, to act, to make things right. The restaurant had fallen silent, the clatter of forks and hum of conversation replaced by a tense stillness. All eyes were on the unfolding scene, the weight of it palpable. Derek, the manager, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of irritation tinged with embarrassment. He was a man accustomed to control, to making decisions that went unquestioned in his small domain. But now, confronted by the three Navy officers, his authority seemed to shrink, exposed as fragile in the face of their unyielding resolve. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, his voice tight. "This doesn't concern you." The words were meant to dismiss, to reassert his dominance, but they landed like a misfired shot, hollow and ineffective. Marcus turned to face Derek, his voice low but clear, each word deliberate. "You just ejected a disabled veteran in front of 3 active duty Navy officers. So explain yourself before we call Homeland Security." His tone was calm, but there was a steel beneath it, a warning that this was not a man to be trifled with. Marcus's heart raced, not with fear, but with the clarity of purpose that came from years of training, from missions where hesitation could mean failure. He thought of his own service, of the brothers in arms he'd lost, and the promises they'd all made to uphold the values they fought for. To see Raymond disrespected felt like a betrayal of that promise, and Marcus wasn't about to let it slide. James, standing just behind Marcus, stepped forward to pick up Raymond's ID card from the floor. His fingers brushed the worn plastic, and he felt a surge of reverence as he placed it back in Raymond's trembling hands. "Thank you for keeping your oath," James said softly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked into Raymond's eyes, seeing not just the man before him, but the decades of service, the battles fought, the injuries endured. James's own service felt young in comparison, but he understood the unspoken bond that tied them together, a bond forged in sacrifice, in the quiet moments of courage that no one else saw. His chest tightened with a mix of pride and anger, pride for Raymond's resilience and anger at the indignity he just endured. Raymond sat at his table, his crutch propped against the chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to anchor himself. He felt the weight of the moment, the eyes of the restaurant on him, the sting of Derek's earlier dismissal still burning in his chest. He had come here for a simple lunch, a moment of normalcy in a life forever altered by war. The rejection had hit him harder than he'd expected, not because he hadn't faced it before, but because it never stopped hurting. To be reduced to an inconvenience, to have his service questioned, felt like a wound reopened. Yet, as he looked at the 3 young sailors standing before him, their faces a mixture of resolve and respect, something shifted inside him. Their solidarity was a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone, that his sacrifices hadn't been forgotten by everyone. Will Monroe's voice cut through the tension again, addressing Derek directly. "Sir, do you understand what just happened here?" His words were calm, but they carried the weight of someone who had seen the cost of service up close, who knew what it meant to stand for something greater than oneself. Will's mind flashed to the training exercise they just completed, a grueling test of endurance and teamwork that had left his team battered but triumphant. He had brought Marcus and James here to celebrate, to share a rare moment of camaraderie away from the demands of their duties. But now, watching Raymond's quiet struggle, Will felt a different kind of duty rise within him, not to his team, but to the broader brotherhood of service. He thought of his own mentors, the veterans who had guided him, and the debt he owed them. To let Raymond be treated this way was unthinkable. Derek's face flushed a deeper shade of red, a mix of anger and humiliation warring across his features. "Look, I don't care who you people think you are," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "I'm the manager here, and I make decisions about seating arrangements." His words were defiant, but there was a tremor beneath them, a crack in his confidence as he realized the situation was slipping beyond his control. Derek prided himself on running a tight ship, on maintaining order in his restaurant. But now, faced with the unyielding presence of the three Navy officers, he felt the ground shift beneath him. The weight of their authority, their unity, was something he couldn't dismiss with a wave of his hand. Marcus took a step closer, his SEAL training evident in the controlled precision of his movements. "What we are is United States Navy," he said, his voice steady but laced with an edge that made Derek flinch. "What you are is someone who just discriminated against a disabled veteran." Marcus's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the clarity of purpose that had guided him through countless missions. He thought of the veterans he'd met, men and women who carried their scars, both visible and invisible, with quiet strength. To see Raymond treated as less than he was, as less than the hero Marcus knew him to be, ignited a fire in him that he struggled to keep in check. James, standing just behind, added his voice, soft but no less powerful. "Sir, that man served this country for over 2 decades. He earned the right to eat lunch wherever he chooses." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of conviction, of a young man who had seen enough of the world to know what mattered. James's mind flickered to his own deployments, to the moments of fear and triumph that had shaped him. He thought of Raymond, of the years he must have given, the battles he must have fought, and felt a surge of protectiveness. To James, Raymond wasn't just a customer. He was a symbol of the sacrifices that made his own service possible. Maria, the server, had been watching the confrontation with a growing sense of dread, her heart sinking as she realized how far things had escalated. She hurried over, clutching Raymond's sandwich and coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Ellis, please forgive us," she said, her voice thick with sincerity. "Please sit back down." Maria's cheeks flushed with shame, not for herself but for the situation, for the way Raymond had been treated in a place where she worked, where she tried to make people feel welcome. She glanced at the 3 sailors, her eyes brimming with gratitude for their intervention, and then back at Raymond, hoping he could see that not everyone here shared Derek's callousness. Raymond looked around, his gaze moving from the 3 sailors to the other customers, some of whom were now watching with quiet intensity, others pulling out their phones to capture the moment. He felt a mix of emotions, humiliation from Derek's treatment, gratitude for the sailors' support, and a quiet resolve not to let this define him. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I can eat somewhere else." The words were humble, but they carried a weight that silenced the room, a reminder of the dignity he held onto despite everything. Will's response was immediate, his voice firm but kind. "No, sir, you shouldn't have to eat somewhere else. You were here first. You ordered your meal, and you've done nothing wrong except serve your country with honor." His words were a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Will's heart swelled with a mix of pride and responsibility. Pride for Raymond's service, responsibility to ensure he was treated with the respect he deserved. He thought of his own career, of the men and women he'd led, and the promise he'd made to uphold the values they all fought for. This moment, in a small restaurant, was as much a test of that promise as any battlefield. Derek's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him as he realized the tide had turned. The other customers were watching, some snapping photos, others typing furiously on their phones, no doubt sharing the incident on social media. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the potential for this moment to spiral into a public relations nightmare. His pride still stung, but he knew he was outmatched. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "He can stay this time, but in the future, I need advance notice for any special accommodations." The words were a last-ditch effort to save face, but they rang hollow in the face of the sailor's resolve. James stepped forward, his youthful features hardened with determination. "Sir, there's nothing special about treating a veteran with basic human respect," he said, his voice quiet but piercing. "That should be standard operating procedure." His words hung in the air, a final rebuke that left no room for argument. James's heart raced, not with fear, but with the certainty that he had done the right thing, that he had honored the legacy of men like Raymond. He glanced at his teammates, at Will and Marcus, and felt a surge of pride in their unity, in the way they had come together to right a wrong. The restaurant remained silent for a moment longer, the tension lingering like a held breath. But in that silence there was a shift, a recognition of the power of solidarity, of the unspoken bond that tied Raymond to the three sailors, and of the quiet strength that had turned a moment of indignity into one of triumph. In a small, bustling restaurant, the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation filled the air. But for Raymond, a weathered veteran, the atmosphere was heavy with indignity. He sat alone at his table, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses, trying to mask the sting of humiliation. For 37 years, since his days of active duty in the Navy had ended, Raymond had carried the weight of his service quietly, his sacrifices tucked away in the crevices of his memory. Today, however, a confrontation with Derek Morrison, the young man behind the counter, had left him exposed, his pride bruised. Derek had dismissed him as a bothersome old man, a problem customer whose presence seemed to disrupt the rhythm of the lunch rush. Raymond's heart sank as he felt the familiar ache of being unseen, his years of service reduced to a mere inconvenience in the eyes of someone too young to understand. Across the room, 3 Navy SEALs, Lieutenant Commander Will Monroe, Chen, and another sailor, watched the scene unfold. Their eyes, trained to notice the smallest details in high-stakes missions, caught the subtle slump of Raymond's shoulders, the way his fingers tightened around his coffee mug as if anchoring himself against the tide of disrespect. For Monroe, a seasoned leader from SEAL Team 2, the sight stirred something deep within, a blend of protectiveness and righteous anger. He exchanged a glance with Chen, whose usually stoic expression softened with a quiet resolve. These men, hardened by their own trials, recognized a fellow warrior, not just in Raymond's past, but in the way he endured the moment with dignity, despite the sting of dismissal. Without a word, they rose from their seats, their movements deliberate, their presence commanding the attention of the restaurant. Monroe approached Raymond's table, his hand resting gently on the older man's shoulder, a gesture that carried the weight of respect and camaraderie. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but warm, "would you allow us the honor of joining you for lunch? It would be a privilege." The words hit Raymond like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. His eyes glistened, the tears he tried to hide betraying the depth of his emotion. No one in all the decades since he'd left the Navy had ever called his company a privilege. The simple acknowledgement unlocked a flood of memories. Nights spent under fire in Vietnam, the camaraderie of his fellow corpsmen, the lives he'd fought to save. "That would mean a great deal to me," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with gratitude. The 3 sailors gathered their plates and drinks, moving to Raymond's table with a quiet reverence. What had begun as a moment of humiliation transformed into something sacred, a gathering of warriors from different eras, bound by shared values of duty, honor, and sacrifice. As they settled around the table, their conversation flowed easily, filled with the kind of mutual respect that only those who have served can fully understand. Raymond's heart swelled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging that had long eluded him. The SEALs, too, felt the weight of the moment. For them, this wasn't just about righting a wrong, it was about honoring a man whose courage had paved the way for their own. Around them, other patrons began to sense the significance of what was unfolding. A woman at a nearby table, her phone discreetly capturing parts of the encounter, felt her own heart stir. She wasn't just witnessing a kind gesture, she was seeing the embodiment of honor, a reminder of the unbreakable bonds that tie those who have served, no matter the years or battles that separate them. Within minutes, she would share the moment with a local veteran support group online, her caption reading, "3 Navy heroes just stood up for an older veteran being mistreated. This is what honor looks like." Her words would ripple far beyond the restaurant, touching hundreds of thousands in a matter of hours. Behind the counter, Derek Morrison stood frozen, the weight of his mistake dawning on him. He had seen Raymond as a nuisance, someone to be brushed aside in the chaos of the lunch rush. But as he watched the 3 sailors treat Raymond like family, he began to understand the magnitude of his error. These men, in their crisp uniforms, saw something in Raymond that Derek had missed. A brother in arms, a man whose sacrifices deserved reverence, not scorn. His stomach churned with regret, the realization sinking in that his actions had not only disrespected Raymond, but had also violated the unspoken code of respect that binds those who serve. Patel, the restaurant's owner, emerged from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour from preparing for the afternoon rush. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the three sailors at Raymond's table, the quiet reverence in their postures, and the lingering tension from the earlier confrontation. Her confusion quickly gave way to resolve. She crossed the room with purpose, her expression unyielding as she approached Derek. "You need to come with me to the office now," she said, her voice low but firm, leaving no room for argument. Derek's shoulders slumped as he followed her, the weight of her disapproval pressing down on him. He knew this wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about a failure to see the humanity in a man who had given so much. As Derek disappeared into the back, Monroe turned to Raymond, his curiosity genuine. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what was your rate in the Navy?" Raymond's face broke into a faint smile, the first of the day, as memories of his service flooded back. "Hospital corpsman, Fleet Marine Force. 2 tours in Vietnam," he said, his voice steady with pride. The SEALs exchanged glances, their respect deepening. They knew the legacy of Navy corpsmen who served with Marines, men who trained toward danger to save lives, their courage etched into the annals of military history. "Doc," Chen said softly, using the term of respect reserved for medics, "the honor is definitely ours." The word doc carried a weight that made Raymond's chest tighten with pride and gratitude, a reminder that his service still mattered. The moment wasn't captured on video, nor did it need to be. The woman 2 tables away, moved by what she had seen, wrote a detailed account of the encounter and shared it on a local veterans forum under the title, "3 Men Who Stood Up." Her post spread like wildfire, garnering 400,000 shares in a single day. It wasn't the spectacle that resonated, but the quiet power of the act. 3 men who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice, not because Raymond was a veteran, but because he was a man who didn't defend himself. Monroe, when later asked about the incident, brushed off any praise. "It wasn't because he was a veteran," he said simply. "It was because he was the only person who didn't defend himself." His words captured the essence of their actions, a stand for dignity, not just duty. The story didn't end at the restaurant. Raymond was later invited to an appreciation ceremony at the local Naval Academy, organized by the same 3 sailors who had stood by him. There were no microphones, no cameras, just a chair in the center of the courtyard and a midshipman reading a speech dedicated to a man who had once been asked to leave a table but had never abandoned his post. Raymond sat quietly, his head bowed, overwhelmed by the recognition. In the weeks that followed, his mailbox overflowed with over 300 handwritten letters from strangers, each one a testament to the impact of his story. Among them was a hand-drawn card from a child, its message simple yet profound. "Thank you for not giving up, even when other people gave up on you." Raymond held the card close, his eyes misting as he read the words, a reminder that his quiet resilience had touched lives he'd never met. 3 days after the incident, Monroe received a call from his commanding officer. Expecting a routine check-in, he was unprepared for the conversation that followed, one that would underscore the ripple effect of their actions that day. The story of Raymond and the 3 SEALs had become more than a fleeting moment. It had sparked a deeper reflection on respect, sacrifice, and the bonds that unite those who understand the true cost of service. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as Monroe stood before his commanding officer, the Navy's emblem gleaming faintly on the wall behind. His heart thudded not from fear of reprimand, but from the gravity of what he'd done, standing up for a fellow veteran in that small, unassuming restaurant. He hadn't thought twice about it then, driven by instinct and a sense of right that ran deeper than any chain of command. But now, as the officer's words sank in, pride and humility churned within him. "Son," the officer said, his voice steady but warm, "what you did wasn't just a gesture. You embodied the United States Navy, our honor, our values, our unwavering commitment to what's right, without chasing glory or recognition." Monroe's throat tightened. He hadn't seen it that way. To him, it was just 3 sailors stepping in when someone was wronged. The officer leaned forward, his eyes piercing but kind. The man you defended, Hospital Corpsman Raymond Ellis. Do you know who he is? Monroe shook his head, a flicker of curiosity sparking. I looked into his record, the officer continued. 2 tours in Vietnam with the 3rd Marine Division. Awarded the Silver Star for charging into enemy fire to save wounded Marines. During the Tet Offensive, he saved 17 lives. A shiver raced down Monroe's spine, cold and electric. Raymond, the quiet, unassuming man at table 6, had never breathed a word of his heroism. Sir, Monroe managed, his voice low. He didn't say anything about that. The officer's gaze softened. Men like Ellis don't. To them, service isn't a badge to flash. It's a duty, carried out without fanfare. Monroe left the office with a storm of emotions swirling in his chest. Respect for Raymond, awe at his unspoken courage, and a renewed sense of purpose in his own service. He hadn't just stood up for a man, he'd stood for something bigger, something the Navy held sacred. Within days, the story rippled upward, reaching the highest echelons of Navy leadership. Not as a scandal or a disciplinary matter, but as a shining example of the values the service sought to instill. The Secretary of the Navy himself reviewed the incident, moved by the quiet heroism of both Raymond and the young sailors. He penned a letter to Raymond, not to apologize for the civilian world's failures, but to thank him for his lifelong example of grace under fire. Reading it, Raymond's hands trembled slightly, not from pride, but from the unexpected weight of being seen. Back at the restaurant, Mrs. Patel was grappling with her own reckoning. The incident had shaken her deeply, stirring memories of her childhood in a military family. Her father, a proud officer in the Indian Navy, had taught her that a uniform, no matter its flag, carried the weight of sacrifice. Standing before her staff in an urgent meeting, her voice quivered with resolve. In my culture, she said, we say the guest is God, but when that guest has served their country, they are family. Her words landed like a vow. She announced sweeping changes. Veterans would get priority seating, military discounts would be expanded, and every employee would undergo training to honor those who served. But her most poignant decision was about Table 6, the place where Raymond had been disrespected. It would become the honor table, marked by a small brass plaque dedicating it to those who served and those who understood service's true meaning. From that day forward, Table 6 was rarely empty. It drew active duty personnel, veterans, and their families like a beacon, fostering a quiet camaraderie rooted in shared values. For Raymond, life shifted subtly but profoundly. He kept his Sunday routine, walking to the restaurant with the same unhurried steps. But now he was never alone. The 3 SEALs, Monroe and his brothers in arms, had made it their tradition to join him for lunch. They didn't come as protectors or out of obligation, but as friends who cherished his stories, his dry humor, and the unspoken bond of service. Other veterans began to gather, drawn by word of mouth. A retired Marine gunnery sergeant, his face etched with years of duty, became a regular. An Air Force pilot from the Vietnam era started bringing his wide-eyed grandson, eager to pass down lessons of honor. A female Iraq War veteran, who'd often felt her service overlooked, found a place where her sacrifices were seen and valued. What began as a table for 4 swelled into gatherings of 20 or more, a tapestry of generations and branches united by respect. Mrs. Patel, watching from the counter, quietly expanded the space, dedicating an entire section to what regulars called the Veterans Corner. The restaurant became a sanctuary, its reputation spreading through the military community like wildfire. Local news caught wind of the weekly gatherings, their cameras eager to capture the story. But Raymond, ever the quiet hero, gently declined every interview. Some things mean more when they're not for show, he told a persistent reporter, his voice calm but firm. We're not here to be examples. We're here to be community. His words carried the weight of a man who'd seen enough of the world to know what mattered. 6 months later, Derek Morrison, the former employee whose actions had sparked the upheaval, stood in a different restaurant, facing a manager's probing question. Why did you leave your last job? Derek's shoulders sagged, the memory still raw. He could have dodged, could have spun a half-truth, but something in him had shifted. I made a mistake, he admitted, his voice steady despite the shame. I disrespected a customer, a veteran, and I learned the hard way that respect isn't optional. The manager's face remained neutral, and Derek didn't get the job. But as he walked away, he carried a lesson etched into his core. Actions have consequences, and dignity is non-negotiable. Meanwhile, the restaurant thrived as a haven of honor. Mrs. Patel, watching veterans laugh and share stories in the Veterans Corner, felt a quiet pride. She thought of her father, of the values he'd instilled, and knew she'd done right by them. Raymond, surrounded by friends old and new, felt a warmth he hadn't known he'd been missing. And Monroe, back on duty, carried the memory of that day like a compass, guiding him to live with the same quiet courage that defined men like Raymond Ellis. The little restaurant, once just a humble spot for a quick meal, had transformed into something far more profound, a living testament to service, respect, and the unbreakable bonds of community. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about the people who gathered there, the stories they shared, and the quiet choices that shaped something enduring. A young Navy recruit, barely out of the grueling haze of boot camp, had heard whispers of this place from his instructors. They spoke of it with a kind of reverence, not just as a diner, but as a sanctuary of sorts. On his first leave, he made his way there, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and awe. Inside, he found Raymond, the man at the center of it all, seated at his usual table, surrounded by a tapestry of faces, veterans young and old, their laughter and stories weaving a thread across generations of service. The recruit, Raymond Ellis, hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his crisp uniform. He stepped forward, his voice soft but steady. "Sir, I heard about what happened here, about your time in Vietnam and what you did. I wanted to say thank you." His words carried the weight of a young man standing on the edge of his own uncertain future, looking to a man who had walked that path decades before. Raymond looked up, his eyes tracing the lines of Corman's earnest face. For a moment, he saw himself reflected there, 50 years younger, full of fire and hope, yet shadowed by the unknown. The weight of memory pressed against his chest, not just of his service, but of the incident that had sparked this very legacy. "Son," he said, his voice low and warm, like a fire on a cold night, "all you need to do is your duty with honor. That's the only thing any of us can do." His words weren't grand, but they carried the quiet strength of someone who had lived them. Corman nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Before turning to leave, he reached into his pocket and placed a small American flag pin on the table. A simple gesture, a token of respect for a story that had grown far beyond one moment of injustice. It was his way of adding to a legacy that had taken root in that very room. A legacy that reminded everyone that dignity and respect were not just ideals, but choices made in the quiet moments when the world wasn't watching. The incident that had started it all, a fleeting act of disrespect toward Raymond, had faded into the background, overshadowed by something far greater. The restaurant had become a beacon, a place where people came not just to eat, but to feel connected to something larger. Table 6, where Raymond had once been asked to leave, was no longer just a table. It had been reborn as the honor table, a sacred space where no one sat without purpose. A cup of coffee rested there always, accompanied by a small sign that read, "For those who were asked to leave but stayed with dignity." It was a quiet tribute, a reminder of resilience and grace under pressure. Raymond, though he still came every week, never sat there again. He chose other tables, leaving that one untouched, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence for what it represented, a memory that belonged to everyone now, not just him. The restaurant's staff, new and old, were trained not just in service, but in the story of that table. They learned its history, its weight, and the responsibility it carried. Veterans who showed their identification were offered priority seating, a small but meaningful gesture. One day, a curious customer tilted her head and asked, "Why go through all this trouble?" The server, a young woman with a sharp gaze and a kind smile, didn't hesitate. "Because here we don't wait for the world to tell us how to show respect. We just do it." Her words were simple, but they carried the conviction of someone who had seen the impact of those choices firsthand. The honor table became more than wood and varnish. It became a symbol, a pilgrimage site for veterans who traveled from near and far to see it, to touch the edge of a story that resonated deep in their bones. Mrs. Patel, the restaurant's owner, noticed a change in the air. Sundays, once the quietest day of the week, now buzzed with life. Military families, veterans, and everyday folks filled the tables, drawn not just by the food, but by the sense of purpose that lingered in the room. "It's strange," she confided to her assistant manager, her voice tinged with wonder. "We're busier than ever, making more money than I could have imagined." But the money was never the point. Her assistant manager, a former Navy petty officer with a weathered grin, nodded knowingly. "Ma'am, when you honor service, service honors you right back." His words hung in the air, a truth as solid as the table itself. 3 months after the incident, a group of high school students arrived on a field trip, their chatter filling the restaurant with youthful energy. Their teacher, a Marine veteran with a quiet intensity, had brought them there for a purpose. She led them to the honor table, her voice steady as she recounted its story. "This is where you learn that standing up for what is right doesn't need anyone's permission," she told them, her eyes scanning their young faces. "Sometimes it just means standing up." One student, his curiosity piqued, raised his hand. "What happened to the manager who was mean to the old man?" The teacher paused, her expression softening with thought. "He learned that every action has a consequence," she said carefully. "And sometimes those consequences help us grow into better people." Raymond, seated nearby, overheard the exchange. His heart stirred, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. He approached the group, his steps slow but deliberate. "Children," he said, his voice gentle but commanding attention, "what matters isn't what happened to that manager. What matters is what you choose to do when you see someone being treated unfairly." His words landed softly, but they carried the weight of a life lived with purpose. A young girl, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear, raised her hand. "But what if we're scared?" she asked, her voice trembling. Raymond's face softened into a smile, the kind that held years of hard-earned wisdom. "Being scared is part of being human," he said. "Being brave means doing what's right even when your heart's pounding. That's what makes it count." The teacher snapped a photo of Raymond with her students, not for likes or shares, but for their classroom wall, a reminder of a lesson that no textbook could capture. Later, she would tell her colleagues that her students had learned more about courage in that restaurant than they ever could from a lecture or a page. The moment lingered in their minds, a spark of understanding that would shape them in ways they couldn't yet see. 6 months later, Derek Morrison, the former manager who had once asked Raymond to leave, stepped back into the restaurant. His shoulders carried the weight of his past mistake, but his eyes held something new, a flicker of humility, a desire to make amends. The room seemed to hold its breath as he stood there, a man confronting the consequences of a single choice and the legacy it had unintentionally sparked. Derek Morrison stepped into the warmth of Mrs. Patel's restaurant, the familiar clink of dishes and hum of conversation wrapping around him. His purpose wasn't to savor the rich aroma of spices or claim a seat at a crowded table. No, he was here for something heavier, something that had been gnawing at his conscience for weeks. He approached Mrs. Patel, his voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "I need to apologize," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that felt raw, almost painful. "And I want to ask if I could volunteer here, maybe help serve meals to veterans during holidays." The words spilled out, each one carrying the weight of regret and a desperate hope for redemption. Mrs. Patel, with her sharp, discerning gaze, studied him. She didn't respond immediately, her silence forcing Derek to confront the vulnerability of his request. "We will," she finally asked, her tone neither accusing nor dismissive, but searching for the truth beneath his words. Derek swallowed, his throat tight. "Because I've been blind to things I should have seen," he admitted, his voice softer now, as if confessing to himself as much as to her. "I need to learn what I missed, what I failed to respect. And maybe, just maybe, I can do something to make sure no one else ever feels the way I made someone feel." His words hung in the air, fragile but resolute. Mrs. Patel considered him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then with a nod, she agreed, but not without conditions. Derek would work unpaid shifts during veteran appreciation events, not just serving food, but listening, truly listening to the stories of those who came. He would immerse himself in their experiences, learning what respect meant not as an abstract idea, but as a lived, breathing reality. Derek accepted without hesitation, a flicker of gratitude warming his chest. This was his chance to rebuild something he hadn't even realized he'd broken. The first veteran Derek served was Raymond Ellis, the very man whose quiet dignity had unraveled Derek's arrogance months before. Raymond sat at a taste, his Sunday newspaper spread before him, his weathered hands steady as he turned the pages. When he looked up and saw Derek approaching with a coffee pot, surprise flickered in his eyes. "I remember you," Raymond said, his voice low, carrying neither anger nor judgment, just recognition. Derek's hands trembled as he poured the coffee, the dark liquid sloshing slightly in the cup. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the one who asked you to leave." The admission burned, but it was necessary, a truth he couldn't dodge. Raymond nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "And now you're here asking to serve." A faint smile curved his lips, not mocking but knowing. "That's what redemption looks like, son." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap in Derek's chest, stirring something deep and unspoken. From that day forward, Derek returned every Sunday pouring coffee, learning names, and absorbing stories of courage, loss, and sacrifice. Each conversation chipped away at the walls he'd built around his heart, teaching him lessons Raymond had imparted without ever raising his voice. Transformation, Derek realized, didn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it unfolded in the quiet rhythm of a coffee pot, one act of service leading to the next. The honor table, a simple wooden surface reserved for no customer, stood as a silent sentinel in the restaurant. It held no plates, no glasses, yet it brimmed with meaning, a reminder that the most significant seats are often those we reserve for principles, not people. Visitors began to notice it, drawn not by its appearance but by the story it carried. Over time, it became a landmark, a place where strangers from distant cities paused to reflect on what it represented: dignity, respect, and the quiet power of standing up for what's right. Raymond Ellis, the man at the heart of the story, lived quietly, as so many veterans do. No one in the restaurant knew the full scope of his military service, what he'd seen, what he'd endured. He never spoke of it, and no one pressed him. Yet his silence held a weight that commanded attention. Being asked to leave a restaurant table hadn't broken him. What moved others was how he rose from that moment, his head held high, his voice steady but soft. That day, 3 sailors had stood with him, not out of obligation, but out of instinct. Their act was simple, unadorned by heroics, yet it spoke a truth that echoed far beyond the restaurant's walls. A soldier never eats lunch alone. A year after the incident, Raymond received an invitation to speak at the Naval Academy's graduation ceremony. True to his nature, he declined with a polite letter, unwilling to step into the spotlight. Instead, he sent words meant for the young sailors embarking on their service, words that were read aloud to the graduating class. "You will face moments when you must choose between what is easy and what is right," he wrote. "Choose right, not for applause, not for medals, but because someone before you made that same choice for you." His letter closed with a quiet charge. Honor isn't a badge you pin to your chest. It's carried in what you do, especially when no one's looking. The words lingered in the air, sinking into the hearts of those who heard them. 3 years after that day in the restaurant, Raymond passed away peacefully in his sleep. His funeral drew hundreds, many strangers whose lives had been touched by his story, even if they'd never met him. The honor table was draped with an American flag for a week, a tribute that felt both solemn and fitting. Visitors left tokens of gratitude: flowers, challenge coins, handwritten notes scrawled with thanks for a man who'd taught them without preaching. Derek, now a full-time volunteer coordinator for Veteran Services, placed a simple card on the table. "Thank you for teaching me that respect isn't given. It's earned," he wrote. "And once earned, it should never be questioned." The honor table remains in the restaurant today, still empty of customers but overflowing with purpose. It stands as a quiet testament to the power of unspoken words and the battles won not with fists, but with the courage to stand when others need you most. Some moments, it reminds us, require only that we rise, because standing up in the right way at the right time can change everything.